All right, let's talk about something that can really trip up even the most experienced accountants, impairment testing, when you've got leased assets in the mix. We're going to get right into the weeds on how to handle right-of-use assets, or ROUAs, when they're part of a bigger cash-generating unit. You know, getting this stuff right is absolutely crucial under IFRS 16 and IAS 36.
So let's just kick things off with a question I hear all the time. IFRS 16. It's complex, right? So it's super tempting to think, hey, can I just make my life easier? Maybe I can test my CGU the old way, on a pre-IFRS 16 basis. It kind of feels like a smart shortcut. Just leave out the right-of-use asset and the liability and just factor in the lease payments like we used to.
Well, the guidance on this one is about as clear as it gets. The answer is a hard no. Trying to use that pre-IFRS 16 approach, it's a total non-starter. It just flat out doesn't comply with the standards. And as we're about to see, it can lead you to some seriously wrong answers. So yeah, that shortcut, it's officially off the table.
Okay, so if the old way is out, what's the right way in? Well, it all begins with figuring out where that right-of-use asset actually fits into your impairment test.
Here's the first big rule you've got to remember. A right-of-use asset, think about a leased store or a critical piece of factory equipment, it doesn't make money all by itself. It works as part of a team. And because of that, you almost never ever test it for impairment all on its own.
So that leads to the obvious next question, right? If you don't test it by itself, how do you assess it? What's the right group to test it with?
And the answer is the cash-generating unit, the CGU. It's pretty logical, actually. If that leased asset is helping a CGU bring in cash, then IAS 36 says you must include its value as part of that CGU when you run the impairment test. It's on the team, so it gets tested with the team. Simple as that.
Right, so the asset is sorted. We know where it goes. But as you know, every right-of-use asset has a dance partner, the lease liability. And figuring out what to do with that is where things start to get really tricky.
This right here is a huge point of confusion for a lot of people. So we've added the asset's value to the CGU. But what about the liability? Do we add that in too, or do we leave it out of the carrying amount that we're testing?
And the answer, believe it or not, is it depends. It completely depends on which test you're using to figure out the recoverable amount. If you're doing a value in use or VIU test, you generally exclude the lease liability. But if you're doing a fair value less cost of disposal test, you include it, but only if a potential buyer would have to take on that liability. So the method you choose completely changes how you treat the liability. So why the different rules? Well, the key thing to get your head around is that the value in use model is all about operational cash flows before financing. In a lease liability, that's a form of financing. So if you were to include it in the carrying amount for a VIU test, you'd be making a classic apples to oranges comparison. You'd be comparing pre-financing cash flows to a post-financing carrying amount. It just doesn't work.
Okay, this leads us straight to the next big puzzle. If we've kicked the lease liability out of the CGU's carrying amount for our VIU test, what on earth do we do with the actual cash payments for the lease in our forecast?
This table lays it out perfectly. On the left, look at what's excluded. It's the future payments, principal and interest, for leases that you've already put on your balance sheet as a liability. Makes sense, right? Those are financing flows. Now on the right, this is what you must include. These are any lease-related payments that weren't capitalized. Things like variable lease payments, payments for short-term or low-value leases, and this is a big one, any future payments you expect to make to renew or replace leases to keep that CGU going. Those are all considered operating cash outflows.
So why all these specific rules? It really comes down to two big ideas from IAS 36. The first is consistency. By excluding the recognized liability from both sides of the equation, the carrying amount and the cash flows, you get a true apples-to-apples comparison. The second is completeness. By including future outflows for things like renewals, you're making sure your forecast is realistic about what it's actually going to cost to keep that CGU humming along.
All right, pop quiz time. Let's see if this is all sinking in. Have a look at these three options. Which one of these should be included in your value in use cash flow forecast? Is it A, B, or C? Take a quick second.
And the correct answer is A, lease payments for a short-term lease. If you pick that, you nailed it. Why? Because if you used the short-term lease exemption, that lease was never capitalized. So the payments are treated as regular operating cash outflows and have to be in your forecast. The other two, B and C, are both related to a recognized liability that's already on your books, which means they are financing flows and stay out.
Wow, okay, we have covered a lot of detail here. So to make sure this is all super practical and easy to remember, let's just boil it all down into a simple checklist you can use.
Here it is, your 4 key rules. Number 1, never, ever use that pre-IFRS 16 shortcut. It's a trap. 2, always include the right-of-use asset in the carrying amount of its CGU. 3, for a value-in-use test, you exclude the lease liability from that carrying amount. And finally, 4, make sure your VIU forecast only includes the correct future lease payments, basically the ones that aren't already tied to a liability on your balance sheet.
So there you have it. The key to this whole thing is consistency. Following these rules makes sure your impairment test is compliant, and just as important, that it actually gives you a true picture of what your assets are worth, which of course leaves just one last question for you to think about. Now that you know the rules, which of your CGUs might need a second look?